Early in 1959, in the Soviet city of Sverdlovsk, a 23-year-old engineering student named Igor Dyatlov put together a winter hiking expedition. This was not a casual outing. The group came from the Ural Polytechnic Institute's tourist club, and each member carried the kind of experience that earned official ratings in Soviet mountaineering. They planned a long ski trek through the northern Ural Mountains, aimed at reaching and returning from remote peaks deep in winter. Their goal was ambitious but clear: to complete a route difficult enough to qualify as a top-level expedition, the kind that proved discipline and endurance. They mapped a path north through settlements and forest tracks, then into open mountain terrain where there were no roads and little shelter. The route demanded steady progress every day. That schedule mattered because the farther they travelled, the fewer outside options existed if weather, injury, or simple delay began to stack up. They understood what the northern Urals offered in late January and early February. Temperatures routinely dropped far below freezing, and wind turned minor mistakes into emergencies. Snow buried landmarks, erased trails, and punished anyone who stopped moving for too long. Even with strong skills and good planning, survival depended on staying together, protecting clothing and gear, and choosing camps carefully. They set out anyway, believing training could manage the risks. Winter had different rules. The expedition left with confidence and a clear calendar. They travelled by train and bus from the city toward the far north of the Ural Mountains, moving from paved roads to places where transport stopped and walking began. Each transfer took time. Supplies had to be repacked, permits checked, and distances re-measured against winter reality. On paper, the route stayed neat. On the ground, the schedule already started to bend. As they pushed deeper into the northern Urals, progress slowed for practical reasons, not dramatic ones. Winter travel meant heavy loads, limited daylight, and constant decisions about where to sleep and how much ground could safely be covered. Small delays stacked up: late starts, longer rests, extra detours to keep the group together. Nothing looked like a crisis. But the plan depended on timing, and their margin for error quietly shrank with every day. That slipping timetable mattered because the outside world measured safety by dates. The group's return was expected, and the next steps, messages sent, worries raised, searches approved, would later hinge on when they failed to appear. If they ran late, it looked normal until it didn't. Every day behind schedule pushed the alarm later, and every later alarm meant more time passed before anyone went looking. In Winter Mountains, time became evidence. The last confirmed day began with a simple goal: push over the high ground and drop into the next valley on their route north. They packed in freezing wind, shouldered heavy loads, and moved slowly through deep snow. Progress did not match the plan. By afternoon, their position still left them short of the shelter of forest. They had to choose between losing more time or taking a harder, riskier line. They angled up toward the slopes of Kholat Syakhl, likely to keep a straight bearing and avoid backtracking in poor visibility. But that decision carried a cost. Higher ground meant stronger wind and less natural cover. The surface changed under their skis, and the climb drained energy they needed for camp work. As daylight faded, the margin for correcting a mistake narrowed. Every minute made the next choice more permanent. They stopped on the open slope and set the tent there, rather than retreating down to the tree line. It saved distance for the next day, and it kept their route clean and direct. It also placed them where weather and terrain offered little protection. The tent ended up on an exposed angle, with wind pressing into it and snow drifting around it. That single practical decision fixed their last known location and set the conditions for what followed. Sometime after the group settled in for the night, a break happened that none of their planning prepared them for. They did not leave by the normal entrance. The fabric of the tent later showed long slashes that started from the inside, as if someone needed an exit immediately and could not wait. That detail mattered because it suggested urgency, not routine. Whatever drove them out, it acted fast, and it overruled basic survival sense. Inside the tent, their gear and clothing stayed behind in a way that did not match an orderly move. In deep winter, experienced hikers did not step outside lightly dressed unless the danger inside felt worse than the cold outside. The cut marks pointed to a decision made under pressure, possibly in seconds. It meant they believed staying put carried an immediate risk, and once they left, the situation changed from a difficult night to a race against time. From the tent, a clear line of footprints later led away across the snow and down toward the darker ground below. The tracks did not scatter at first, which suggested the group moved together, not in a panicked sprint. Some prints looked like socks or bare feet, others like partial footwear, showing they left in whatever they had on. The trail created a simple, chilling fact. They walked away from shelter on purpose, and they did it into the night. By mid-February, the hikers' silence stopped looking like a small delay and started looking like a problem. They had been expected to send a message confirming they were back, and it never came. At first, people around them assumed bad weather or a slow route explained it. But the days kept passing. Families pressed officials and the Institute to act. Once the group became officially overdue, the waiting ended and the search began. The first search parties moved out along the planned route with a simple goal: find tracks, find campsites, find any sign the expedition continued. Volunteers joined alongside trained rescuers, and aircraft were used to cover ground faster. The teams worked outward from the last known area, checking likely stopping points and scanning ridgelines where a tent might have stood out. Then, on the slope where the group had last camped, searchers finally located the tent. The tent did not look like a place anyone had calmly packed up and left behind. It stood abandoned, and it showed clear damage that mattered immediately to investigators. The fabric had been cut open from the inside. Inside, essential items remained, as if the hikers had gone out without preparing for a long absence. That detail shaped the first official reading of the scene. Soviet investigators treated it as an emergency exit, and the case shifted from missing persons to unexplained flight. The first bodies appeared at the edge of the forest, where the open slope finally met cover. 2 hikers lay near the remains of a small fire, positioned as if they had tried to make a last shelter from the cold. The detail that hit investigators immediately was clothing, or the lack of it. They wore only underwear and scraps of fabric, not the layered gear expected on that mountain. The examinations began to steer the case in a new direction. Skin and hands showed damage consistent with exposure, and the soot and burned material suggested they had fought to keep that fire alive. There were injuries, but not the kind that clearly explained death by violence. Instead, the pattern looked like a body shutting down in extreme cold. That raised a hard question. Why had they reached the tree line so underdressed? Investigators then had to consider what the bodies did not show. There were no clear signs of a sustained struggle at the scene, and no obvious weapon wounds that settled the idea of an attack. But the situation still felt wrong. People did not abandon boots and coats in those temperatures unless something forced them to move fast. The tree-line findings narrowed the possibilities to panic pursuit or a desperate attempt to survive. After the first 2 bodies were documented at the tree line, searchers followed the line back toward the slope. On that route, they found 3 more hikers, spaced apart as if they had moved in stages. One lay closest to the forest, another farther uphill, and another closer still to where the tent waited in the open. Their positions changed the meaning of the scene. This no longer looked like a single collapse. It looked like an attempted return. Investigators compared distances, body posture, and what each person wore. The pattern suggested that after time at the fire, some of the group left the trees and tried to reach the tent. They did not make it. Each body lay on the same general line, as though strength failed step by step in the cold and wind. Clothing differences mattered too. Some had slightly more protection than others, hinting at hurried sharing or stripping after death. That implied decisions made under pressure, not random wandering. With 5 bodies now accounted for, the investigation began to build a sequence. The 2 at the fire appeared to have died first, consistent with exposure after a desperate attempt to keep warm. The 3 on the slope appeared to have followed, as the remaining hikers pushed uphill toward the tent and dropped where they fell. That left 4 still missing, and it raised a hard question the case could not escape. If people tried to go back, something at the tent still mattered enough to risk dying for. When winter loosened its grip, the search returned to the mountain with a new problem. Snowmelt exposed what had been hidden for months. Down in a ravine beyond the tree line, rescuers found the last missing hikers. They were not spread across open ground like the earlier bodies. They were clustered in a depression, partly covered by packed snow, as if the landscape itself had held them back from view. The first examinations changed the tone of the case immediately. These bodies showed injuries that did not fit simple freezing. Several had massive damage inside the chest, and at least one had a skull fracture, yet there were few or no clear external wounds to match the force required. That mismatch mattered. It pushed investigators away from one clean explanation and toward competing possibilities. A violent impact, crushing pressure, or something else entirely. Then the reports noted something even harder to process, missing soft tissue, including parts of the face. In a case already filled with uncomfortable details, this one carried a different weight because it looked like mutilation at first glance. But spring also brought animals, water movement, and months of exposure, all of which complicated what missing really meant. The ravine discoveries forced the investigation to widen, and certainty became harder to claim. With all 9 bodies recovered, the Soviet investigation moved from searching to explaining. Officials gathered medical reports, mapped where each person fell, and compared injuries to what the terrain could do. They noted no clear signs of a struggle at the tent and no obvious weapon wounds. The final paperwork settled on a broad phrase: an unknown compelling force. The case file closed. The mountains kept their answer. That closure did not mean certainty. The wording protected the state from picking a single cause it could not prove, and it ended questions the country did not want. Over time, pieces of the record surfaced again. Photographs, witness notes, and laboratory summaries that hinted at what had been minimized or left vague. Later readers saw contradictions in timelines, gaps in testing, and conclusions that jumped ahead of the evidence. Decades later, reviews used declassified material and new forensic thinking to test what still fit the facts. The strongest scenarios focused on mechanisms that explained the same pattern at once: a sudden trigger that pushed them out fast, a controlled movement away from the tent, and then a split between exposure deaths and crushing injuries in the ravine. Each re-evaluation narrowed the field. It also exposed how much the original conclusion avoided saying. Decades later, the Dyatlov Pass case stopped being only a campfire mystery and became a problem people tried to rebuild step by step. Modern teams mapped the slope, measured angles, and compared them to how snow actually behaved under wind and time. They tested how a tent on that incline could have become unsafe fast, without warning. The question shifted from who attacked them to what made trained hikers abandon shelter. From the records, the strongest explanations kept circling one core idea: a sudden, believable threat near the tent, followed by a chain of bad choices forced by cold and darkness. A small slab of snow, a partial collapse, or fear of a larger slide explained the cut exit and the decision to move downhill. Once separated from gear, everything became arithmetic. Minutes turned into hours, and exposed skin and wet clothes decided what happened next. That framework also fit what never quite matched a simple freeze. Some injuries resembled high force without clear external wounds, and the ravine terrain offered a plain mechanism. Falls onto hard snow, ice, or rock made worse by exhaustion. Missing soft tissue stayed harder to lock down, but ordinary scavenging and decomposition stayed consistent with the timelines. Modern reviews brought clarity, not comfort. The confidence of early 1959 met a reality where small events still killed.